So, tonight we have on the line the head of the World Nazarene Assembly, the very well known Rabbi James Scott Trimm. How are you doing this evening, Rabbi Trimm?
Shalom, doing just great.
Great. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your organization?
Sure. We are people ask me the difference between Messianic Judaism and Nazarene Judaism, and I'll tell them Judaism. Uh, so we're a group of believers in Yeshua as the Messiah. We believe that Yeshua came to be the Messiah of Judaism rather than to create a new religion. And you and I would agree on a lot more probably than we disagree. Um, for example, I believe you and I would take the same side about the concept of oral Torah versus the Karaites.
Okay.
Um, so yeah, that's where we're at.
You've been doing this for a long time. Can you tell us a little bit of what got you on this track?
Sure, a little bit after the flood.
Okay.
Just kidding. Not quite that long. Um, so I first became a believer in Yeshua as the Messiah when I was about 17 or 18 years old. And I don't recall exactly whether it was before. It was during my senior year of high school. Um, and there was this very pretty girl named Wendy uh, uh, who was an evangelical Christian. And back then, I was actually something of an anti-missionary, although we didn't use the term. And I would debate back and forth with her and about Yeshua. And one day, she invited me to her church with her. And well, Wendy was really good looking, and I would have gone on a date to hell with her if she'd asked. So we went, and after it was a youth meeting on a Wednesday night. After it was over with, um, everybody was all wandering around, and I was there by kind of sitting alone by myself, not knowing anybody there. And so I just took a moment to pray, and I just said, if Yeshua is really your son, prove it to me. And so a voice came to me and said, John 1:34. And I actually had obstinately brought my JPS Tanakh with me. So I pulled a Bible off the little slot on the pew in front of me and looked up John 1:34, and it said, and I have seen and borne witness that this is the Son of God. It was Yochanan speaking, John. And so I said, well, I guess he must be your kid. And so I started doing research on it, and my research has led me in some directions that were probably unusual. One of the things was I didn't buy the idea that the Jewish people would be writing authoritative religious literature in Greek at the time, and certainly not in Judea, in the land. And so I started looking for Hebrew and Aramaic sources, and sure enough, I found them. And I found some books that had been written, a century ago and such by great scholars arguing that all or part of the so-called New Testament had been written in Hebrew or Aramaic. And I found that there were actually Hebrew and Aramaic manuscripts, and tracked them down and started working in that direction. So my faith is based on Hebrew and Aramaic manuscripts rather than the Greek. And I was going to Wendy's church at first on Sundays and going to my old synagogue on Friday nights and Saturdays. And I was really a round peg in trying to fit into a square hole everywhere I went. And the pastor of the church came to me and said, you might be better off in a Messianic synagogue. And I said, what's that? Because this was 1984 or so. So Messianic Judaism hadn't been around that long. I hadn't heard of it. And so I started going there. And unfortunately, that particular group was led by a leader who had originally hoped to open the first Jewish Baptist church in Fort Worth, and ended up opening a so-called Messianic synagogue. The more I discovered, the more I learned that Messianic Judaism was kind of like a box of grape nuts. There's not a lot of grapes, but an awful lot of nuts.
Yeah, nutty people. I hear you.
So I soon discovered that what had happened basically when Messianic Judaism came about was there'd been a seminar back in the late '60s, and a lot of the people that later became the leaders in Messianic Judaism, David Stern and whatnot, had participated in this seminar that was thrown by Fuller Theological Seminary on how to reach the Jews with Jesus. And the strategy was concocted to create Messianic Jewish synagogues that would be culturally Jewish churches. And so I found that my Judaism was really unwelcome. And we ultimately had a parting of the ways because
how do you feel about
that?
How do you feel about some sort of obligation to reach the Jews with Jesus or Yeshua?
Oh, personally?
Yes.
Well, my belief is that the Torah requires the acceptance of Mashiach. It is, and I base this on Devarim chapter 18, the prophet like Moshe. And it says in the Torah that I will require it of you. And the Targum to that passage says that
I said Torah and you say Targum. The Targum is just a translation. Now, I haven't checked it here for myself to see what it actually says, but in many cases it just brings in a cultural understanding of that time when that translation was made. In other words, you might as well be quoting Rashi. In terms of the literal meaning of that chapter, that seems to be the only location in Torah where we're commanded to listen to prophets in general. And that's how the chapter begins. It says that when you begin to emulate the nations that you've displaced, God will raise up unto you a prophet. And now, back then, this is the first understanding of future prophets, because there's no other commandment in Torah that commands us to heed their words. And this prophet was to be like Moses, because Moses was the lawgiver, and the job of these future prophets is to bring you back to that law. That's the way I always understood it. It clearly says, and the prophet who does speak what I don't command him, i.e. prophets in plural, right? And the prophet that does so, that lays on the foundation that it's not one prophet, but prophets in general. And this is the only command.
Well, I would argue that that there are sources that indicate that that our fathers understood the passage to refer to the Messiah, and we can see this in the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Clearly, our sages believed in the notion of the Messiah, and they also tied in chapters like Genesis 49 and the whole ordeal with Bilam and Balak to point to the Messiah. But this is much later. According to the literal understanding, it seems that if that's not referring to prophets in general, then we have no command in Torah to obey prophets.
Okay, so I'm not a Karaite. So
I'm not a Karaite either, but this is not a halachic issue.
So let me explain what I mean by that. Being not a Karaite, there was I won't name him, but there was a Orthodox rabbi wanted to debate me on whether or not Yeshua was the Messiah. But he had one stipulation. We could use the Tanakh and the Tanakh only as a source text. And my problem with that is that the concept of Mashiach is an oral Torah concept. Sure, in the literal text of the Tanakh, there is reference to a figure known as the servant in Yeshayahu and some of the other passages. There are references with different Hebrew words behind them to a figure known as the branch.
Right. Tanakh, not Torah.
There are,
right? Or Nach in particular.
Right. There are
Okay.
references to in the Torah to a prophet like Moshe. There are a number of passages which our fathers understood as speaking of the Mashiach. Genesis 49:10, as you mentioned. Um, there are many others, of course.
Hmm.
Uh,
If you agree,
but
these are later interpretations. The
no,
first
I don't
individuals who
necessarily.
had these instructions didn't know of a notion of the Messiah and took it literally to understand that God was telling them to await prophets, that exile and redemption is a formula. That
No,
when
I
in
absolutely believe that
uh
the forefathers, those that passed the oral Torah down the line, understood and believed in the concept of a personal, dynamic figure, which we'll call the Mashiach, that would fulfill all of these passages. That
uh,
was the
there was
and
never
that
a monolithic understanding on any of these passages. In other words, what most people would
oh,
do
it's
is
one of
quote a rabbi
Rambam's articles
here,
of faith.
is quote a rabbi there, and then put all their ideas or midrashim together to in some way develop a new religion, which is what Christianity did. There is not one set book that lays down.
You don't believe that the concept of a Mashiach figure existed before Christianity, before the rise of Christianity?
I mean, I believe Christianity is actually a form of Gnostic slash mystical Judaism. But I mean,
Well,
before the
okay, let's talk
Maccabees.
about Qumran.
Uh-huh.
In Qumran, they had the concept of Mashiach. They had the two Messiah concept, the Mashiach of Aaron
For sure,
the
Mashiach is a Jewish concept, but something could be Jewish and not necessarily based in the Torah. Now, I'm big on
no, but
making a
I'm saying that the
distinction.
Dead Sea Scrolls predate the period that you're speaking of.
Well, not necessarily predated. I mean, it was during that time. Josephus speaks about the group of the Essenes. We're not really sure who resided in the caves of Qumran exactly, but yes, that time was full of messianic fervor. And the reason it was full of messianic fervor is because post the Maccabees, Israel was bombarded with texts of the prophets, mainly because Israel, under the Syrian Greeks, were not allowed to study Torah, so they were forced to extract all their theology and religiosity from these new books they never had, i.e., the books of the prophets, which are
So
filled
you're
with
saying that the
symbolism and hyperbole. I'm making a distinction here between Torah, the five books of Moses, and everything else.
Mhm. Well, now, first of all, I agree with you on the distinction between the Torah, the Navim, and the Ketuvim. Okay, and I agree with you. I will agree with you on the concept that the Torah is our foundation, and then the Navim rests upon that, and that the Torah has greater authority than the Navim. And the reason the Torah has greater authority than Navim is that, hypothetically, if you could determine that Yeshayahu was a false prophet, then that would discount the book of Isaiah, but it wouldn't discount the Torah. But hypothetically, if you could, forgive me for saying it, prove that Moshe was a false prophet, then that would disprove the Torah and Isaiah.
Isaiah exists
So
outside
one is built upon
of
the
his
other.
book. In other words, the book of Isaiah is a book describing the life and times of that prophet, but not necessarily his prophecies. For example, in the book of Second Chronicles, we have Isaiah giving a completely different narrative than what actually appears in the book of Isaiah. In other words, these are just historical books. There's no command in Torah to document the words of the prophets and use them as some sort of almanac. The job of the prophet was only to bring people back to Torah. And that is what either classified them as a true or false prophet, not taking their poetic hyperbolic statements out of context and then awaiting some Messiah every generation. In other words, we have no commandment to write the books of the prophets or to think that progressive revelation exists in our religion. In other words, you're saying,
Well, I don't know.
uh,
It depends on what you mean by progressive revelation.
well, you're saying the book of
If
the
you mean by
prophets
progressive revelation,
has some authority
go ahead.
in itself. That's what I mean by progressive
Well,
revelation.
well, because when the prophet says, "Thus saith the Lord,"
Right, he's giving you a
then
historical account of what
then
occurred.
it's either true or not true what he's spoken. And he's either a false prophet or not a false prophet. And actually, the Torah gives us two portions where it talks about a false prophet. One is Devarim 13 and the other is Devarim 18. But if he's a false prophet, then we are required by Torah not to give any heed to it and to reject it. So
the way we determine if he's a false prophet or not is not by analyzing his book, is by seeing that when he appeared on the scene, if his prophecy came true. In other words, exile and redemption is a formula laid down in Torah. And it goes like this. Once we fail to keep God's commandments, God brings in prophetic intervention. That's Deuteronomy chapter 18 right there. And then with Deuteronomy 27, 28, 29, and Leviticus 26, he will exile us. And then he will only bring us back once we repent, once we do tshuva. So that's the formula that Deuteronomy 18 perfectly fits into. This is why it's the crowning jewel of that portion in Deuteronomy, because it tells us that God will give us a chance through prophetic intervention. But it mentions nothing about books of the prophets. In other words, the job of the prophet was only to speak to that generation, to bring them back to Torah.
So let me ask you a question. Do you consider the book of Isaiah canon?
Not in the way that a Christian considers it canon. For example, in Judaism, what we consider canonical are books that are considered mitamei yadayim, books that were impurify the hands. Here, for example, it's the Catholic Church that invented Tanakh, by the way, because a Jew would never have thought of combining the books of the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, along with the writings and the prophets. Why? Because you would have what occurred in the 9th century, a group called the Karaites, making no distinction between a pasuk in the book of Amos and a pasuk in the book of Exodus and Shemot, because they consider it all the same. But of course it's not the same. In halakha, there isn't even a way to copy the books of the prophets. The books of the prophets could have been written by memory, and we see this, that the scrolls of the prophets that we found in the caves of Qumran are slightly different than the prophets that appear in the Masoretic text, because they didn't...
Wait a minute, that's also true of the Torah.
No, not at all. I mean, perhaps in one letter or two, yeah, but not in terms of whole words.
Oh, no, I'm very familiar with this subject. There are several places where there are substantive differences between the text of the Torah.
In Hebrew?
And I say the Torah, in the Hebrew, that are found at Qumran.
So you'd have to show it to me. And also,
sure.
Qumran was the Geniza. So if there was a Sefer Torah with an error, it could have been that it was placed there because of that error. But
there are several of these examples are cases where a Torah manuscript found at Qumran agrees with the Septuagint against the against the Masoretic text. So not only would it have to be an accident, but it would have to be an accident that somehow made it into the translations and propagated in the Septuagint.
The Septuagint that we have today is not even the actual Septuagint that was translated by the 70.
Well, which part are you talking about? The Torah in the Septuagint or the Nach?
The 70 never translated Nach.
That's correct.
Any Greek translation of canonical books nowadays is automatically called Septuagint, almost in a royal fashion. But the Septuagint was only the 5 books of Moses.
There was another manuscript. There were later Greek translations that were not Septuagint. Theodotus, I think his name was, created one. These were intended to be replacements for the Septuagint. And Aristobulus stated in his writings that back in the days of Plato and Socrates, there were Greek translations of the Torah available before the Septuagint.
I'd like to see that.
And he made the case that Aristobulus made the case that Plato and Socrates had been influenced by the Torah.
Mm-hmm.
So there's definitely a case there in
There's
the
no proof
Greek
of that.
text.
I don't think Ptolemy
No, I'm not saying there's proof. I'm just saying that
so would have
historically
commissioned
that
the 70. Well, the reason he commissioned the 70 is because he wanted a copy of the Torah for the great library in Alexandria, because there
library.
was
He wanted
no.
a standard copy, yeah,
Right.
not just uh, uh, a informal translation that floated around prior to that. Um, and the Wisdom of Ben Sirach in the Greek version, which was translated by, I believe, Ben Sirach's own grandson, in the preface, references the prophets and the writings in the Greek, in Greek, meaning that by that time they existed in Greek, and I think that puts it about 150 BCE. So there was a
Well, Greek was the
standard
lingua
Greek
franca
version.
of the time. Well, the reason the Septuagint carries any weight is because of the legend attached to the tale of the 70 who were put in different rooms and miraculously.
Sure, sure, I agree. And the Alexandrian Jews absolutely believed that Philo, or Philo is the more correct pronunciation of his name, of Alexandria, absolutely believed that, and the Septuagint was his Bible.
Right, the five
It
books of
was his
Moses.
Tanakh.
Right. Well, not Tanakh.
Not just the five books of Moses. He mostly quoted from the five books, but he occasionally quoted from the others.
Yeah, but he never referred to it as a Septuagint. Here again, well, the reason the word Septuagint carries weight, it's because it was the official Greek translation of Torah.
Yeah, Philo referenced the legend of Aristeas in the letter of Aristeas, and he certainly believed that, and he made statements that made it clear that he believed that, because he, in his commentary, refers to the Greek words that are used in the Septuagint, that to him, he believed that was inspired because he was making commentary on those Greek words as if that was, the specific Greek word that was used there was.
This is a non sequitur because Philo Judaeus existed during and after Jesus. I mean, not before, in terms of his great.
Well, yeah, it was essentially contemporary.
Right. I'm just saying. I think everyone acknowledges, especially with all the times the New Testament quotes the books of the prophets, even passages in the books of the writings, that Greek versions of that existed at that time, mainly because the New Testament is written in Greek. But I'm pretty sure no one connects the prophets and the writings as part of the actual Septuagint. That was my point. That the Septuagint is just the five books of Moses.
Let me address that very quickly. Yes, the Greek New Testament sometimes quotes the Septuagint against the Masoretic text. At times, it quotes a completely unique Greek text that doesn't agree with any of it. But what's interesting is that the Peshitta Aramaic New Testament tends to quote the Peshitta Aramaic Tanakh. And the Hebrew and Aramaic, the Hebrew manuscripts that we have of Matthew and Hebrews tend to quote the Masoretic text. Not only that, even though there may be places where the so-called New Testament quotes the Tanakh in a way that agrees with the Septuagint, now that we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, we've discovered a number of Hebrew manuscripts in the Dead Sea Scrolls that had readings that agree with the Septuagint against the Masoretic text. So a New Testament quotation that agrees with the Septuagint against the Masoretic text may be agreeing with a Hebrew text that existed at that time that agreed with the Septuagint against the Masoretic text, just like certain Dead Sea Scrolls do. Because the old wisdom was when the Septuagint had a reading that disagreed with the Masoretic text, it must have just been bad translation.
I'm not attacking
and sometimes it is. Sometimes
the New Testament's translation of Nach. I mean, outside of those portions that mention that Abraham was buried in Shechem, and how many people left for Egypt, or those couple verses in the book of Hebrews. But in terms of the hierarchy in Scripture, I'm just letting you know that there's a big distinction in the Jewish world between the five books of Moses and everything else that came later. And I know Karaites and Christians.
I agree with you.
Right. No. Well, I mean, Karaites and Christians make no distinction. I mean, they quote the book of Isaiah.
I think that there's a conceptual distinction that's a difference theoretically that has no real practical application. And what I mean by that is that uh, uh, it only would, because if the Torah, if you could prove that Moshe was a false prophet, that would discount the Torah. And it would discount the Tanakh, because the Tanakh is built upon it. However, if you couldn't prove that Moshe was a false prophet, but you could prove Isaiah was, it would only disprove Isaiah. It wouldn't disprove the Torah. Mm-hmm. Now, it's a difference that has no point, in the sense that if Isaiah wasn't a false prophet, and I don't believe he was, and when he said, "Thus saith the Lord," it really was the word of Elohim.
I'm not here to say that Isaiah is a false prophet.
Then it doesn't. I believe it makes no difference in the end, because there are no two true facts that ever contradict each other.
Hold on one second. Hold on. I'm not saying that Isaiah is a false prophet. I'm saying that Messianics and Christians are mistranslating what's written there. And the way Isaiah is classified as a true or false prophet is not by the words that appear in the book of Isaiah, but by the prophecy he gave over to Israel, to Judah at that time, as they were being invaded by Assyria and the northern kingdom. That was his job. That is what made him a prophet, not the poetry and symbolism that we can't even verify as true.
What I'm saying, though, is
in the book of Isaiah.
In the end,
I'm sorry?
In the end, if Isaiah was a true prophet, and the things that he spoke and said, "Thus saith the Lord," really were the word of Elohim.
Again, that's not what validates him as a prophet. The hyperbole that appears in those books, we don't even understand, nor in the vast majority of cases are able to link to what he says in Chronicles. In other words,
what I'm trying to say is that when we look at it today, we don't, as long as we can maintain that Isaiah wasn't a false prophet, then Isaiah and the Torah were both spoken by Elohim, and neither one of them can contain any lies.
No, it doesn't work like that, because we don't believe in progressive revelation. Not even...
I'm not talking about progressive revelation.
Well, you're saying that because he says, "Thus says the Lord," God is in some way giving us a progression in our revelation through Isaiah.
No, that's not what I'm saying. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is that there are no two true facts that ever contradict one another. There's only one truth.
Do you believe that there's anything new that appears in the book of Isaiah that's not mentioned in the Torah?
Sure.
So you believe in progressive revelation?
The Torah. Okay, if that's the way you want to define progressive revelation, as I've seen progressive revelation defined in the past by the Seventh-day Adventists, for example, is progressive revelation comes along and says, "Okay, I'm going to tell you some things now that contradict what I told you before, because you weren't ready to understand them yet."
It doesn't have to contradict it. It's adding to it.
And next week I may tell you some new things, and they may not necessarily agree with what the previous revelation was, but that's because you weren't ready for that yet. Mm-hmm. And no, I don't believe that concept of progressive revelation that you see in Adventism.
It sounds like you believe in a heavier form, because you believe that his revelation mentions something that you need in order to be validated and saved in the next life. In other words, you believe that Isaiah is speaking about a Messiah or an event that's going to happen, that if you fail to embrace as the pivotal moment of your religion, you're going to be cast into...
That's where we go back to our original disagreement. I find that in the Torah.
It's not literally in the Torah. As a matter of fact...
In fact, the Torah says, even if we follow your interpretation...
What commandment in the 5 books of Moses commands you to listen to a prophet like Isaiah?
Deuteronomy 18.
Right. So it can't be telling you to await someone like Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, and at the same time to await a Messiah, unless you believe the Messiah is another prophet.
Unless you believe there are layers of meaning to the Torah.
Oh, okay. All right. So now we're talking about foreshadowings. I'm just trying to stick to the literal text in the Torah. If there's only one commandment, to listen to prophets, that's what we do. We listen to the prophet when we begin to sin, because God always brings prophets when Israel is missing the mark. Not for no reason. That's the role of the prophet. As a matter of fact, at the end of chapter 8, Isaiah says, for the word and for the testimony. If my words do not speak of Torah, there is no light within it. The job of the prophet is only there to amplify Torah, not to add anything new. And again, he's only speaking to the people in front of him in his time. Because, again, God rose him up. He brought him up at a specific time for a specific task, not for his books to be kept like some sort of almanac that every generation believes that their generation is the last one or the blessed one or the one that's going to usher in some messianic age. That's already.
So let me share with you a concept here. I believe that the Torah is an expression of the mind of Elohim. Okay? So when Elohim created the heavens and the earth, he did so through, well, in the same way that anybody would create something. It was created in his mind first. What I'm going to create. First, the idea that I'm going to create, and then what I'm going to create. And then, having created a model in his mind, if you will, of, like if I'm going to paint a horse, in my mind's eye, the horse is in my mind before I put it on the paper. Okay? So the creation itself is the mind of Elohim manifest in the universe. Okay? This mind of Elohim manifest in the universe, to me, is synonymous with the Torah and is synonymous with the Mashiach.
I mean, you could believe that, and I'm okay with you believing that, but it would be wrong for you to say that God's going to condemn someone else for not seeing what you see. In other words...
So what I'm saying is the Torah is the Messiah and the Messiah is the Torah.
And you can believe that again. But how can you judge a whole world that refuses to accept Yeshua as the Messiah?
Well, I'm not their judge.
Well, you're reminding them that if they fail to accept him as Lord and Savior, God is not going to validate them.
No. My view is that if they are rejecting the Messiah, they are rejecting the Torah. They just may not realize it.
Right. That's your understanding.
They are rejecting the Torah.
I have no problem with people understanding portions in Torah in a devotional manner. But how can you use that thought, that chiddush, as a piece of binding legislation to almost condemn all those who fail to believe?
So here we go back, circular thinking. Here we go back to Deuteronomy 18 and my understanding of Deuteronomy 18 versus your understanding.
But again,
of Deuteronomy 18.
No, hold on.
But
there's the literal understanding, and there's
that agree with my interpretation of Deuteronomy 18.
No, that's fine.
Rambam agreed with my interpretation of Deuteronomy 18,
and the Rambam believed that Yeshua wasn't the Messiah.
No, Rambam. Yeah, I'm not debating that. I'm saying that Rambam believed.
I'm just saying,
that
only because someone happens
was referring to the Messiah.
In some way add devotional notions to chapters in Torah doesn't mean that he's willing to exclude someone from Israel who chooses to agree or disagree with his interpretation. In other words, in the Jewish world, if you want to be Chabad, if you want to be Satmar, if you want to believe that your Rebbe's the Messiah, that's fine. I don't think there's any Lubavitch who walks around thinking that if you fail to believe that the Lubavitch Rebbe was the Messiah, that you are no longer Jewish and not validated by God. That's what puts Christianity, Messianic Judaism, or Nazarene Judaism outside the fold, that they're willing to exclude others because they don't agree with their interpretation.
So Rambam says that belief in a personal Mashiach, as an actual person, is one of the 13 principles of faith that defines what is or is not a Jew. So certainly Rambam would do that. Let's talk about Mishnah Sanhedrin chapter 10.
Wait, hold on.
The whole chapter...
I mean, to go back on the 13 principles of faith, he's not excluding people because they happen to believe or not believe in a specific Messiah. Now, his statement there in the 13 principles of faith is on waiting on a Messiah. Not even the belief in an actual Messiah, but the waiting on a Messiah. So you're telling me that Hillel Hazaken, Hillel the elder, of who it states that he didn't believe in the coming of a Messiah. He didn't await a Messiah because he believed that Hezekiah Melech, Hezekiah was the Messiah, would not be considered a Jew in the Rambam's eyes? Of course he would. The 13 principles are not halakha. They're the Rambam's opinion, what at his time was acceptable beliefs in his community. And there's many rabbis who disagree with his rendition of those 13 principles. He's not laying down halakha.
Let me address Mishnah Sanhedrin 10. I think it's, I'm going off the top of my head here, but I think it's Mishnah Sanhedrin 10. It may be 11, but I think it's 10:1. All Israel has a part in the world to come. And then it says something effective, these have no part in the world to come. So it's laying down a definition of who is not a Jew, if you will, who is not on Israel.
Not who's not a Jew.
And there's a whole list of beliefs that say that according to Mishnah Sanhedrin 10, are a person who believes that has no part in the world to come, which, as a matter of logic, means that if all Israel has a part in the world to come, they aren't part of Israel.
First of all, that's a medrash there. And there, I mean, it ties in believing in the resurrection of the dead, and he who doesn't believe in the resurrection of the dead won't partake within it. That's a medrash there. If someone is keeping Torah, both Torah Shabbat Peh and Torah Shabbat Biktav, he's a Jew, 100%. Okay, even if he worships idols, he's an apostate Jew. Now, there's many different groups within Israel that believe different things. As a matter of fact, history teaches us there were 7 sets of Pharisees. Now, I think that you're confusing Agadah with Torah Shabbat Peh, because in the beginning you said that you believe in the oral law, and in some way that
I said I believe in the concept of oral Torah.
Okay, fine. So you're quoting Midrashim, in some way connecting that with oral law, but folklore and legend has nothing to do with oral law. Oral law has to deal with halacha, what you actually do, not what you believe.
There's a difference between what we think right there. I think there's the Peshat, the Remez, the Drash, and the Sod.
That's a much later concept than visited in the 13th century.
The Peshat for the oral law is expressed in the Mishnah. The Remez of the oral law is expressed in the Gemara. The Drash of the oral law is expressed in the Midrash. And the Sod is expressed in the Zohar.
All right.
And then we'll do a whole different
that's a much later concept, by the way. With the notion of Pardes as a guide to interpreting and deciphering Scripture was post the 13th century. Now, the word Pardes and the story that appears in the Gemara of the individuals that went to Pardes and the whole story with Acher and Rabbi Akiva, that did happen, according to that Medrash, before the Zohar. But the idea is the acronym Pardes, Peshat, Remez, Drash, and Sod, that's post the 13th century, part of Kabbalistic Judaism. In other words, there was never an allowance for people to decipher what Torah is trying to tell them with the notion of Remez and Sod. Now, Drash and Peshat, everyone agrees on that.
Well, let me give you a good example of Remez. Remez understanding of Torah. The Torah says an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Now, by the way, we understand that halachically as a law of having to do with liability, not as a law of retribution. But nonetheless, it says an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. It doesn't say anything about ears.
Okay.
So how would we apply it to ears? Well, through the Remez.
No. There's something called the Sanhedrin.
We may infer that would also apply to ears.
People did not decipher Torah by just reading it for themselves and applying rules of hermeneutics on their own. There was always a court, all the way from the time of Moses, really explained in Deuteronomy chapter 17 and in many other places in Torah, that gave the elders what later became the Great Court, the men of the Great Assembly, the Sanhedrin, the authority to create laws or interpret Torah as binding, i.e. considered civil law of the time, binding on all of Israel. That's not an example of Remez. I mean, as a matter of fact, we have the 13 principles of exegesis, which is part of Torah that has notions like Kal
Vachomer. The 13 rules of Ishmael, yes.
Right, okay.
We have the
but that has nothing to do with Pardes.
The
Okay.
32 rules of Eliezer. Well, no, wait a minute. Now, the 7 rules of Hillel
Okay.
are the Pesach. The 13 rules of Ishmael are the Remez. The 32 rules of
All right, so
Eliezer
you're making that as you
are
go
the
along because
Drach.
it doesn't appear like that.
And the 42 rules of Kabbalah are the Zohar,
All right.
of the Sod.
So the Zohar is a book that was written in the 13th century, along with other books that are considered pseudepigrapha like Sefer HaBahir, Shir Koma, and many other books that appeared
So,
late on
so
the
what if I
scene.
told you?
Hmm.
What if I told you that I could prove the Zohar, the core of the Zohar? I'm not saying that it might not have evolved, but that the core of the Zohar was probably written by Rabbi Shimon, as it claims, but certainly was not written in the 13th century CE.
Go ahead.
Now here's my evidence for this. I have discovered not only are there a number of places where the Zohar references the Book of Enoch, but there are a number of places where it cites material from the Book of Enoch in connection to the name of the Book of Enoch correctly, and a number of places where it references wholesale material from the Book of Enoch in detail.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, the Book of Enoch was not available in Europe in the 13th century. It was only available in Ethiopia.
No, no, no.
In the Western
In the
world, it was
last 80
considered
years,
lost.
the Ethiopian church had a copy of the Book of Enoch in Ge'ez, but that's in the last 100 years.
Yes.
Now, what do you consider the Zohar? You're probably thinking about the Tikkun Zohar. Now, this was written in the last 500 years. There's many, many additions that were added to the Zohar. And I have a whole video, and I list all these additions to the initial book of the Zohar, which was only a commentary to the 5 books of Moses. Right.
Yeah, I'm not talking about the
All right. So
the
all
Tikkun
those
Zohar.
later
I'm talking about the
editions
Zohar proper.
that were not written in the 13th century, they were written much later. They were added in. Like I said, all these Gnostic books that are found amongst Israel share
So the
similar
book,
midrashim.
so the
Midrash
Book of
Rabbah.
Enoch was lost. The Book of Enoch was lost
I'm not saying
to
the Book of
Europe.
Enoch. Well, first of all, I'm pretty sure that the Tikkun Zohar never says, "Thus the Book of Enoch says." You're saying that a medrash, something that's not halachic, some tale, crept into that book. I mean, I can't verify because you haven't quoted the page or anything, but I don't think this
So,
verifies that it was written by Shimon Bar Yochai. I mean, there's many reasons that disqualify the Zohar as a book that was written by Shimon Bar Yochai. With the initial books that were a commentary to the Torah, like for example, because it was a commentary to the Torah and Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai existed in the land of Israel, not in Bavel, we know that Israel kept a 3-year cycle of Torah readings and not a 1-year cycle. But the Zohar is split up in the parshiot we have today. I mean, that's one example that it could not have been written by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Two, it mentions Muslims in the Zohar, how God blesses Muslims or Arabs because they have adopted circumcision on the 13th year. It also mentions the Crusades. I have a whole video on the Zohar with sources on this. Now, anyways, even if the book of the Zohar was written by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, this is not the way Torah Shabbat Peh works. If it would have just been written by him, it would have been the opinion of one man. But like the Rambam writes in Hilchos Sanhedrin, that the Sanhedrin rules by vote, not by the opinions of one man, and their rulings are limited to legal matters. In other words, if the court, or even Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, had the authority of the metaphysical, why didn't they rule whether the Messiah should come tomorrow or that the Romans should be
because
drowned in the sea? Because
there are
anything.
there are two kinds of oral Torah.
Oh, well, now you're
One kind of
extending on your
no, hold
answer.
on. Let,
Uh-huh.
let me finish.
Sure.
There are the rulings of the Sanhedrin. Okay, and the I won't say just the Sanhedrin of the body of elders, beginning back in Devarim 17, and moving forward through the Great Assembly and through the Sanhedrin and so on. Okay. There is also oral Torah from Sinai. You all believe in oral Torah from Sinai?
The notion of halacha leMoshe Sinai is still legal matters. not metaphysical issues. And the Rambam limits those to 30. Many rabbis disagree on those 30 of the Rambam because the Rambam's criteria to label something as halach leMoshe Sinai, laws that were given to Moses at Mount Sinai, is if in the Mishnah or in the Brises there were any discussions on these issues. He names like a handful of them, that tefillin have to be black and so on and so forth. However, this is only regarding halacha, things you do, not things you believe. In other words, anything metaphysical has to come from the 5 books of Moses because that's the only book or the only books that have the authority of the metaphysical because we got those words from Hashem. The job of the court is only to rule on legal matters. I'm sorry?
But the written Torah isn't all that Moshe received on Sinai.
I don't believe that Moses received the oral law on Mount Sinai. I'm of the opinion that the court developed it. It really shouldn't matter because we have a commandment to listen to the court.
Leviticus 26, the final verse, says that Moshe received Torahs on Mount Sinai, plural. But
that's not what Hebrew says.
Say that means that he
Torot in Hebrew means instructions.
And our sages say that's because he received 2 Torahs, oral Torah and written Torah. But let's pause for a moment.
Hold on 1 second. You're quoting the Rabbeinu Akadosh, who brings one interpretation that Torot could mean 2 Torahs, but in Hebrew it just means instructions. If you're sticking to the Peshat, well, first of all, it's kind of ridiculous to believe that what Moses received on Mount Sinai is the 5 books of Moses that we have today. He received the instructions.
How long was Moshe on Mount Sinai?
I'm sorry?
How long was Moshe on Mount Sinai?
He was there 40 days, 40 nights.
How many days? 40 days, okay. So let's get a copy of Books on Tape, if you will. Not on tape anymore, but, the audio recording of the Torah, in Hebrew even, and play it. Does it take 40 days? Might take 1. So he received probably 100 times more material on Mount Sinai than we have in our written Torah.
I'm pretty sure that he wasn't just receiving laws on Mount Sinai. I mean, as a matter of fact, God speaks to him on Mount Sinai on what Israel is doing while he was there, i.e. when they were building this golden calf. They were talking about different things. Now, far be it from me to give my opinion of what God was telling Moses, but it wasn't just Moses downloading laws, from God like some big computer. I'm not of the opinion that the oral law was given to Mount Sinai. However, I believe that the oral law has to be obeyed because God himself in Torah tells us to heed the instructions of the elders. So it carries just as much weight as I believe.
There are several things which the Torah says were oral Torah from Sinai, written from Sinai. For example, the water libation ceremony, the Gemara says, I think it's the Gemara. The Gemara says that the water libation ceremony was from Sinai.
That's funny. I'm sure you'll agree that the water libation story is not even in Torah. Look, I think that I'm the biggest proponent for the oral law online, and I've debated more Karaites than anyone. I believe in the oral law, but I think it hurts our arguments to base what we believe as it was given on Mount Sinai instead of
I don't
just
believe all
the
of it was given on Mount Sinai. I believe that there are 2 elements to oral Torah, and part of it was given on Mount Sinai.
All right, so the Rambam writes in Sefer HaMitzvot in his Book of Commandments, what commandment in Torah do we have to believe and obey Torah Sheba'al Peh? And he only mentions Deuteronomy chapter 17. In other words, it either came through or from the Sanhedrin. That's why we believe in the oral law. Now, we, as students of Halakha and Yahadut
and that's
in
where
general,
you thought I was going with Mishnah.
Make a distinction.
That's where you thought I was going with Mishnah Sanhedrin 10.
It sounds like you're making a
later
distinction.
on in Mishnah Sanhedrin 10, it references Deuteronomy 18 and says that heaven would basically execute the person who violated
you're not making a distinction between halakha and agadah. It sounds like you're quoting folklore with the same luster and reverence as you're quoting an actual halacha. And that's
that's a reference. That's Mishnah. That's not Agadah.
So there's no Agadot in Mishnah?
No. Well,
I mean, Perkavot is not.
What I'm quoting is not Agadah. Yes, there's Agadic elements in Mishnah because there are places where there are a handful of places. It's not as common in Mishnah as it is in Gemara, where an authority will cite events that took place, an occasion, in making the case of a halakha that certain
Agadah. is classified as this. Anything in rabbinic literature that's not of a legal nature is considered agadah. So this is
And
why
a tractate of vote is Agadah, of course. Then, so
Pirkei Avot has great advice in it. But you're not going to find halachot in there. Okay?
no, not
What,
if any. Yeah,
all right, so the reason the Rambam codified halacha in Mishnah Torah was to separate agadah from halacha, and he even includes agadot there. There's a huge distinction that I don't think someone is able to make if he's trying to justify the belief in his Messiah through the words of the sages. In other words, God judges you by keeping Torah Shabbat Peh and Torah Shabbat. The rulings that Moses received on Mount Sinai, i.e., the Taryag mitzvot, and the rulings of the elders that God says that by disobeying them, you'd be disobeying God himself. He even ties in that famous passage, burn the evil from amongst your midst, to those who fail to heed the rulings of these elders. That's what
yeah.
makes you a kosher
Of
Jew.
course, of course. In fact, the Gemara says that the rulings of the elders basically are the points out that the penalty for violating the rulings of the elders is death in every case, whereas the written Torah, the oral Torah is violating the oral Torah basically is death on every occasion,
Yeah,
whereas the
that
written Torah it's not always death. If you eat ham, there's no death penalty for that. And in fact, the Mishnah I think gives the example that there's no death penalty for not laying tefillin, but for laying tefillin that have the wrong number of compartments, death is the penalty.
the vast majority of rabbinic laws don't have the death penalty attached to it. I mean, you have makos, you have lashes with the rabbanan or loke. But I'm just saying we have to make a distinction between what actually makes someone a kosher Jew and what makes you a sect. That's fine. Sect doesn't always have to be in a negative connotation. I mean, I consider
I have
Chabad
discovered
a
that
sect.
I have discovered recently. Well, I kind of knew this already, but I'm learning it more and more. That in the first century, and I know that may not necessarily be a special time for you, but in the first century, in the Second Temple era, let me put it that way, there was more than one way to be a Jew. There was Essene Judaism. There was Pharisaic Judaism of the House of Hillel, the House of Shammai, and as you pointed out, seven large groups. House of Hillel and House of Shammai being the largest too. There were Sadducees, and there were Hellenist Alexandrian Jews.
Sounds like you're making my point because I don't condemn you as a Messianic Jew or as a Nazarene. I believe that you could believe in Yeshua, keep Torah Shabbat and Torah Shabbat Peh, and be validated by God. However, you don't believe I can. So it sounds that the plurality you're mentioning that occurred in the first century, you're not adhering to that.
Well, no. I would say that while that was the case, the Essenes, for example, thought that they were the sons of light and everybody else was the sons of darkness.
Oh, right.
And the Pharisees.
So you're aligning yourself.
We keep going back to Mishnah Sanhedrin 10. The Pharisees thought the Sadducees had no part in the world to come.
So you're either aligning yourself with the unconformists, where they're going to condemn everyone to lose their share in the world to come, or you're going to make the argument that they were able to exist in a cohesive manner, all under the authority of this court. Because, I mean, history teaches us that the Sadducees even sat on the Sanhedrin.
Well, there were two Sanhedrins. There was more than one body known as the Sanhedrin. Let me explain what I mean by that. Josephus describes a body, which we see referenced in the so-called New Testament, that was headed by the high priest and had both Pharisees and Sadducees making up its complement, and I believe had 120 members, which would be the same as the Great Assembly had. And by contrast, the Sanhedrin we read about in Tractate Sanhedrin in the Talmud was headed by such as Hillel and those prior to Hillel, but was headed by Hillel and his descendants, who were all of the tribe of Judah, and none of them were high priests.
Wait. There's no
and there
law.
were 70 members, and they were all Pharisees.
Now, there's only one great court, known as the Beit Din HaGadol. They ruled from the Lishkat HaGazit, from the Temple Mount. Now, there were many other Sanhedrins. What you're referring to is the Beit Din Ketana, the court of 23 elders. This is very common knowledge in the rabbinic world. I think people who study Josephus may get confused.
There were two bodies that called themselves the
No,
Great
no, no.
Sanhedrin,
There
and
can't be
one
two
of them
bodies if there's
was
only one Lishkat HaGazit. There's one room of
one
hewn
was
stones, right? And the Nasi was not limited to the high priest. It was traditionally held by the high priest till the priesthood became corrupt and an Israelite moved into that position. But there's no law that says that the Nasi had to be the high priest, by the way.
so Josephus, Flavius Josephus, talks about such a body known as the Sanhedrin that was headed by the high priest at that time, and yet we know that the Sanhedrin that we read about in Tractate Sanhedrin was led by Hillel and then Shimon and then Gamliel during that same time period. Not only that, Gamliel appears to have been a member, only a member of the Sanhedrin that is mentioned in the New Testament, whereas he
Hold
was
on.
the
You're mixing
Nazi of the
times up here.
Sanhedrin.
Gamliel was the grandson of Hillel. And
Exactly.
in that reference
It
to
says
the high
Hillel and then
priest, hold
Shimon
on one
and then
second.
Gamliel, yeah.
In the reference by Josephus mentioning the high priest, he mentions how this high priest became corrupted. Josephus has different books. If you're only reading The War of the Jews, that's dealing with the life and time of Josephus. But if you start from his book Antiquities, that's where he mentions the corrupt priesthood and everything leading up to the Roman invasion. I mean, he talks about the Maccabee story. So, only because you're quoting Josephus does not mean that he's speaking about his time. Yes, the Nasi was initially the high priest, but when the high priesthood became corrupted, and
So
then
I'm referring to Antiquities, Book 20, Chapter 9,
okay, so
Section 1.
Antiquities is predating Josephus. He's giving a historical account all the way from Moses.
Yes, I'm aware of that.
Now, I agree there was more than one Sanhedrin, but there was only one great court that sat on the Temple Mount. But
Now, in addition to this, the Essenes had their own halakhic setup, and it's very clear from their writings that there was no way that they were going to go to the sons of darkness to tell them what halakha was
all right,
and how to walk.
so the Essenes were as disconnected from the Jewish people as the Samaritans were. Here, by the simple fact that they kept every holiday
And
on
yet
a
they were
different
Jewish
day.
people.
I mean, Samaritans were also considered Jews. I mean, Jewish people as a whole, they were as disconnected as the Samaritans. Well, the opinions go both ways in the Gemara on whether Samaritans are considered Jews or not, because supposedly they did convert, but they weren't accepted as part of the fold. One understanding is that the Dead Sea group or the Qumran cult went by a solar calendar, which made their holidays land on different days, and they didn't.
And I'm not convinced that that's actually the case, but certainly
I mean, in the book of
they did
Jubilees
some.
and in the first and second book of Enoch, it speaks about or alludes to this calendar.
Well, let's talk about let's start with the Book of Enoch. If you and I've written an article on this, if you read the Book of Enoch carefully, what it actually says is it talks about if you're probably familiar with the gist of the Book of Enoch, is that in the days before the flood, that there were these fallen angels, and the gist of the Book of Enoch is that there's a connection between the angels and the stars, and the Book of Enoch indicates that after the angels fell, the stars, and it uses the term stars the same way, in reference to heavenly bodies, stopped rising and falling according to the direction that they were told. They were disobedient, and the indication in the Book of Enoch is that they no longer followed their appointed times, and they became wandering stars after that. And my understanding of the Book of Enoch, based upon all of that, is that the calendar presented in the Book of Enoch is or was regarded as an obsolete calendar. It was supposed to be a pre-flood calendar that no longer functioned because of the events that it describes.
Are you of the opinion
I
that
do believe
Enoch actually wrote the book of Enoch?
I am.
Okay, all right. So I'm pretty sure
Now,
like,
can we
no Jew at that
disagree on
time
that?
believed
But yes,
that.
I am.
Telling me before Abraham, somebody wrote a book and it was floating around till now. Here, look, I just made a video on the Enoch calendar, comparing it to the modern day calendar. It came out 2 weeks ago. It clearly
Uh-huh.
says that the biblical calendar is 364 days. And it says that anyone who uses the moon to determine months and to ultimately make up a year is an error. It's clear in it. And this is why there's a new movement that tries to go by this calendar. I mean, the Book of Enoch
Okay,
is
but
pseudepigrapha. It wasn't
the
written by
problem
Enoch.
is that the astronomical section of the Book of Enoch is quite difficult, and in the Ethiopic version, self-contradictory. And unfortunately, we don't have enough of the Aramaic to tell. We don't have enough of the Aramaic to tell us what the Aramaic text of the astronomical section was really saying, but we have enough to see that it wasn't saying the same thing as the Ethiopic. So we don't really quite know what the calendrical section of the original Book of Enoch said.
You don't believe in progressive revelation, but you believe that Enoch wrote the Book of Enoch and gave it to humanity?
Yeah, I believe that Enoch wrote the Book of Enoch, and I don't know what you mean by gave it to humanity, but yeah, he was the initial author. Then Methuselah and finally Noah were the editor redactors of the book that he started.
Now I see why you have no issue taking all these midrash and menagadot literally, because you've been adding to Torah for a long time.
Well, let me read you what the Zohar says here. Zohar,
I don't know about the
Volume
Zohar.
1, 37b.
I mean, I view the Zohar just like I view any medrash.
But you're telling me that what I'm saying about the Book of Enoch isn't in line with what most Jews believe.
No.
And I'm telling you, it's in line with what the Zohar says.
Most Jews are secular, by the way. Okay. The Zohar doesn't speak for Judaism. In other words, if someone chooses to reject the Zohar, they're still considered kosher Jews. If someone says that the court has no authority, then they're puzzle Jews. If they say that Torah has no authority, then they're also puzzle. This is what makes them Jewish. Torah says clearly that if you keep my hukim, my mishpatim, this is what God validates you by. Because the Torah doesn't revolve around some Messiah. It revolves around a good God and a set of instructions to, in my opinion, better this planet. Now, I accept you like a kosher Jew. I mean, if you convert, it doesn't matter, in my opinion, if you believe in Jesus or not. I think that what unites us is that we keep Torah. But you don't offer me that courtesy where you're saying, no, you have to believe in not just the Messiah, but my Messiah in order to be validated by God. And the reason I use validated because I know hell is an overrated concept, and even though the Zohar mentions hell, by the way, and I've said many times that Christians could use the Zohar.
Talmud mentions Gehenom.
Sure. But the Torah doesn't, by the way, nor Nach. I personally believe
they don't mention Gehenom, they mention Sheol, but go ahead.
Right, okay, the pit, fine. So I believe that there has to be something more after this life, especially for those who are evil. However, I don't believe that the Torah requires me to believe in it because it doesn't mention it. And the metaphysical has to come from the Torah, but the legal, outside of the 613 commandments, has to come from the court because that's what Torah says. That's what Torah sanctions. But the Torah does not sanction the belief in a Messiah, or worse, condemn someone for not believing in a Messiah. So it's hard for me to believe that on the day of judgment that God is going to toss a kosher Jew, I mean, someone who made his best attempt to keep Torah, into some place apart from him just because he didn't believe in the Messiah. But the Jew would say...
What does the Mishnah say?
Forget about the Mishnah.
About the person.
The Torah deals with the metaphysical. Now, there are metaphysical concepts amongst Chazal. That's fine. Have you noticed they always contradict each other? Because there's no authority given to man to develop metaphysical issues. That means you can believe what you want. You can believe in Yeshua. The only reason I would like you to follow the path that I'm on is because I believe that believing in Yeshua or being a Nazarene or a Messianic Jew will ultimately hinder your growth academically, theologically, and we see this every day. And will eventually get your philosophy to catch up with you and get you to drop the whole thing, and I've seen it many times. Because the system is pretty irrational.
So, all right, so how long have we been doing this? An hour, almost. So having schmoozed for an hour here, are you the impression that my academic uh, studies have been hindered.
Yes, absolutely.
Really? Because we've been talking on a pretty high level here, haven't we?
For how long have you been doing this for?
30 years, probably. Uh, really more than that. I've been married for 30 years, and I've been studying Torah since I was 14, so
Okay.
longer than that.
So I think that proves my point. If you would have been in yeshiva, in kollel, even part-time, you'd probably know 10 times more than you know now. I'm just telling you.
So let me back up and tell you something. Back in 1988, let me tell you a story you'll find interesting, probably. Back in 1988, I was still attending the Messianic Synagogue over in Fort Worth. But I was kind of a rebel, and they kind of gave me a hard time because I was studying Talmud and such as that. And one day, a man shows up at the meeting, and the leader of the congregation tells everybody, "Stay away from him. He's a quote, a new believer in Messiah, and you should, he's, they didn't say stay away from him, but he said, don't be drawn away by him or whatever. I don't remember, but he shouldn't be teaching or anything." So it turns out he's an Orthodox rabbi. So from Israel. So I go to, of course, the first thing I did was go to him, and I found out that he lived about 20 minutes from my home. And so I immediately started spending every day coming to visit him in his home and study under him. And it was amazing. It was beautiful. Studying the tractates of the Talmud, the Zohar, we spent so long just on the opening chapter of Genesis. Mm-hmm. But at any rate, I did study under an Orthodox rabbi for some time, and then after he was basically called away, left town, I then began studying under another Orthodox rabbi named Rabbi Herbert J. Gilner, who was not a believer in Yeshua as the Messiah, but had no problem with the fact that I did, and studied under him for several years. He has since passed away, but so I have now, I never went to yeshiva, but I have studied under Orthodox rabbis.
I'll take your word for it. Look, the vast majority of people who believe what you believe or use I'm not sure how you call it. People
what do you think the foundational book in my life is?
It's the book that introduced you to your key to salvation. I mean, I assume.
Well, that was a direct revelation, but no, the foundational book in my life is Torah.
Oh, I mean, if it wasn't for the New Testament, I don't think you would know who Jesus is or was.
Are you saying that mankind wouldn't have a historical record of who he was if it wasn't for the New Testament?
Correct.
Is that what you're saying?
Uh-huh.
That might be the case, but then again, I might argue that the New Testament Gospels were the historical record of who he was. That's why there isn't much of another historical record. There wasn't, because
whether you consider it historical or not,
became scripture to somebody. So they kind of got discounted by others.
So whether you consider it historical or not, and I have no problem calling it historical, that is the book that you believe had the keys to your salvation.
By the same token, we'd say the same thing about Moshe. The Torah is a historical record of Moshe.
I have no problem accepting the Torah as faith. My problem is with faith in general. In other words, too much faith is a bad thing. Of course, we agree that the 5 books of Moses are God's instructions. However, if we have to believe in a New Testament, why don't we just believe in a Quran or in the Book of Mormon? In other words, that's a danger with too much faith. This is why we don't believe in progressive revelation. This is why not even a prophet was allowed to add to the Torah.
This is why when I argue that Yeshua is the Messiah, I don't use the New Testament.
But that's a little disingenuous, because if you didn't have the New Testament, you would never have come to the belief in Yeshua.
In my particular case, that might be, that might be kind of, it might be the case, but then I suppose it depends on whether you're taking my perspective or your perspective, because from my perspective, Elohim would have had to use a different means than saying John 1:34, because John 1:34 wouldn't have existed. But that's not to mean what doesn't mean to me that Elohim would have been powerless to find some other way to reach me.
It's funny that God has to give you chapter and verse from the New Testament instead of leading you to some passage in the 5 books of Moses.
Well, there's a funny story. After I became a believer in Messiah, and after I started studying the Messianic prophecies out, I called a friend of mine from synagogue at the time. And I called him up, and he knew what I've been doing. I've been, studying the New Testament and everything. And so I said to him, let me read you something. Tell me what you think. Now, he wasn't a super well-educated Jew, of course, but I started to read him Isaiah 53. And then I stopped and I said, who do you think this is talking about? And you know what his answer was? Well, it's talking about Yeshua, but I don't believe in the New Testament. Mm-hmm. I didn't tell him what I was quoting. I just said,
that was a straw man argument. I mean, come on. I have a whole video showing how I believe Isaiah 53 is talking about prophets in general, in particular Isaiah, but not excluding anyone who will come with a message of rebuke to wicked Israel. Now, if you believe that Yeshua is a prophet, well, that would include him as well. In other words, when God sends messengers and prophets to wicked Israel, they're going to be made to suffer. And that's what I discussed with Michael Brown on the phone and with many others. That's what I see in Isaiah 53.
And the Targum of that passage says it's talking about the Mashiach. The Talmud refers to the passages of Isaiah 53.
When you say the Talmud,
says it's talking about the Mashiach.
But you're not speaking about a monolithic understanding of anything. It's a collection of midrashim and different opinions. Okay, well, so you're telling me that one rabbi or two rabbis may have thought that was referring to the Messiah. That's fine. But you're trying to say it in an authoritative fashion. The Talmud says a Targum. Targum just means translation. And mind you, which
here
Targum?
We must agree. Here we must definitely agree. It is one of my pet peeves when somebody says, well, let me put it this way. Somebody says, asked me one time, do you believe in the Talmud? And my answer was, the Talmud isn't believed, it's studied.
I don't think I ever said or asked you that question. If you
no, I'm not saying you did that. I'm just saying somebody asked me, do you believe in the Talmud? Also, by the simple
fact that you said the Targum. When people think Targum, they think Targum Onkelos. But that's not the Targum you're referring to. You're talking about Targum Yonatan.
No, I'm talking Targum Jonathan.
Okay, fine.
Targum Jonathan is the authoritative Targum of the prophets.
That's what many Christians have called authoritative of the prophets. It's just a translation. Targum just means translation. Okay, when people think Targum, the only thing that gives it authority is because we have a halakha that we have to study the Torah portion with Targum Onkelos. So it's
so the Targums as we know them, although the word Targum means translation, are paraphrases, and I'll even say midrashic paraphrases, and I'm sure you'll agree with that. By contrast, for example, the Peshitta is a literal Aramaic translation.
Not necessarily. Hold on. Targum Yonatan, anything dealing with the prophets, is trying to interpret what that prophet is saying. This is why it's a paraphrase. Exactly. And this is the argument most Messianics make. They make no distinction between the timeline and what's authoritative, like Onkelos, and what's midrashic and agadic, like Targum Yonatan. But they'll just say the word Targum, and anyone listening to them will think that this is authoritative, and if I don't accept this, or if I refuse to recite this, like we're commanded to recite Targum Onkelos, I'm in some way breaking Judaism.
I don't do that at all. I'm just saying that it expresses that at that time period, it was believed by at least the author of the Targum that the passage was talking about the Messiah. This wasn't something Christianity made up after the fact.
I told you earlier that I believe Christianity is a form of mystical Judaism of that time, just like many other Gnostic movements that didn't take off because they weren't ultimately endorsed by Rome. Fine. Something could be Jewish and not have the authority to exclude others from the fold. Even in Judaism nowadays, you have Breslov, you have Bells, you have Bubba. There's so many different groups in the mystical side of Judaism that don't see eye to eye on every issue. But what they don't do is condemn each other to not having a share in the world to come, like Christianity is doing to anyone who fails to accept their gospel.
Okay.
I'm not here to attack you. I'm really trying to build a bridge
here.
The
point is it doesn't derive from me. It's just.
Well, it doesn't derive from the Torah either.
What I see in Deuteronomy. Well, no, it's in the Mishnah applies Deuteronomy 18:19 as a in context apparently is indicating a no afterlife for persons who reject the prophets.
There's a big distinction between rejecting a prophet and not running with a hyperbolic statement that appears in the books of the prophets. A prophet is not connected in any way to the books of the prophets in terms of obedience. Deuteronomy chapter 18 commands us to heed their instructions when we begin to sin. The books of the prophets, now mind you, one really shouldn't study the books of the prophets apart from their historical counterpart in Kings and Chronicles and even in Ezra and Nehemiah. Why? Because if they just read the prophet alone, they'll detach their words from the historical context. The job of the
so let's look at Mishnah Sanhedrin 11:5. His death is at the hands of heaven, for it is written, and it shall come to pass that whosoever will not hearken unto my words which the prophet shall speak in my name, I will require it of him. Mm-hmm. Deuteronomy 18:19. Now here's what the Gemara says. It's in Babylonian Talmud 89a. But he who suppresses his prophecy or regards the words of a prophet or a prophet who transgresses his own words is slain by heaven. Mm-hmm. For it is written, all it shall come to pass that whosoever shall not hearken, yishma. Now this may be understood as implying to proclaim and hearkening himself unto my words. And the verse concludes, I will require it of him, Deuteronomy 18:19, mm-hmm. i.e., he shall be slain by heaven. So,
right, you said it there, prophets in general.
This is a section of Mishnah that starts, I believe, in 11. See if I can find Mishnah 11, Sanhedrin 11:1. I think that's where it may start out, where it talks about all Israel. Is that where it starts? All Israel has a part in the world to come, except, well, no, then it goes on to say, these have no part in the world to come, and it goes on. At any rate,
here, look,
this whole section of Mishnah
Agadot,
is basically...
Hold on 1 second. Agadot and Midrashim have authority when they're repeating a Torah principle. In other words, this in itself is agadic, because it's not necessarily tied to anything halachic. Now, it's reiterating what literally appears in Deuteronomy chapter 18, that we have to heed the works of the prophets. We're heeding their words.
It's talking about the penalty. It's talking about the penalty
from heaven.
From heaven.
Right, not from the court. Fine.
Accepting the right, but the court's got, the reason there's halakhic significance here is that the court has to make a determination on who is and is not under its authority. Because if you're not a Jew, you're not under its authority anyway. If it's the first century and you're a Roman, a Latin-speaking Roman living in Jerusalem, the Sanhedrin's not going to be having a trial about it.
Go back 100 years before, and then Gentiles would be under their authority.
So the bottom line is the Sanhedrin has to make a determination of who is a Jew. Who are we going to accept testimony from? Who is this court? Who is a Jew according to this court?
I just showed you that portion, and also in Sanhedrin, that Hillel did not believe in a coming Messiah. He believed that Hezekiah was the Messiah, and the reign of Hezekiah was the Messianic age. The rabbis have used, well, not just with Deuteronomy chapter 18, with Genesis 49, even in many mystical cases, we're linking it to the angel of the Lord. There are many mystical ideas tied to passages in the Torah that developed this notion of a super Messiah. So the Rambam, like in Hilchos Malachim, he says that this Messiah will die eventually, and his child will take over, and he will be able to sin. In other words, it's just going to be a human. As a matter of fact, Hilchot Melachim is built around the notion of Bar Kokhba. What Rabbi Akiva thought Bar Kokhba could become is what the Rambam paints his Messiah to be. Just a human being. So clearly, I'm not here to say whether the Rambam doesn't believe that the Messiah is going to be a special individual. He's definitely going to be a special individual in the likeness of King David. Why? Because King David is the archetype of the righteous warrior, poet, king. If that's a template you're using, Yeshua has departed from that template.
Okay, so obviously I don't think that Rambam had a 100% understanding of the Messiah, or he would have been a Nazarene. My use of Rambam is simply to show that he understood Deuteronomy 18 through 19 is referring to the Messiah. But let's talk here about
wait, hold on. I mean, I can't. I have to respond here quick.
Sure.
Only because a rabbi could understand a passage in Torah in two different ways. One, in the Pashat level, understanding that this is what it's telling us, but from a devotional level, apply it to a later event. I mean, although the Rambam never subscribed to the notion of Mashiach ben Yosef and Mashiach ben David, he used the poem mentioned by Bilam of the star rising to signify King David as the first Messiah and the future coming Messiah that we're awaiting as the second Messiah. That's a devotional understanding to a passage in Torah. And you know what? I have them also. But I'm not going to say that this is what I can judge you against for not believing. In other words, the Peshat is the Peshat. Deuteronomy 18 is the chapter that all of Israel is held against for not listening to the prophets in general. In other words, you're building Medrash on top of Medrash. You're building Sod and Remez off of what was already understood as allegorical. I'm trying to stick to Torah as some authority, but it sounds like you do believe in progressive revelation. You believe in the hyperbole and folklore found in rabbinic literature as having authority to exclude people from the fold. So it sounds like you're more rabbinic than I am.
Well, I actually think I may be. Maybe not necessarily for that reason, but...
now I would ask, how about all the other Midrashic statements?
I'm close to being... Right. I am close to being a Hasid, in my thinking.
All right, so there's another Midrashic statement
in fact,
that
study the Tanya. I study the Tanya regularly.
I mean, I think that's to your detriment because I think it's a very destructive book. But there's other Midrashim that teach that Yeshua is boiling in a cauldron of excrement. So I guess that you don't accept all Midrashim. No, I'm just saying.
That's not true.
Oh, well.
Okay, you're citing a passage in Talmud. Or are you talking about a Midrash somewhere or the Talmud?
It appears in the Zohar.
Because there's a passage that... I'm sorry?
It also appears in the Zohar. I don't think that really applies to what I'm saying here, because I'm not saying that Yeshua was a bad individual. I'm just saying that if you're truly walking in the traditional path of Torah, then you really should just view Yeshua. I mean, being that you call yourself a chassid, just view him as your Rebbe. Fine. However, to exclude the vast majority of Israel from being validated by God because they don't accept your Rebbe as the Messiah, that's what makes you un-Jewish or un-Torah-like. Because the Torah doesn't authorize for that.
Well, that's our fundamental disagreement about what's the meaning of Deuteronomy 18.
I mean, I'm not trying to condemn you.
It doesn't mean It doesn't mean that I can't embrace people that don't agree with me.
Well, you can embrace them like friends, but you believe that God will not accept them.
Well, I don't know what you mean by accept.
Validate, prolong their life.
He created them. He created them.
There's a lot of creatures that I hope are not validated by God.
I don't know what you mean by validate. This, to me, has more to do with
to be written in a book, let's say.
I
mean, the Torah mentions, and I think that's probably the clearest depiction of validation in Torah, to be written in some book. A book that God, in some way, separates for real Hasidim, real pious ones.
The book of life is what you're talking about.
Okay, whatever that may entail. Right? I mean, I'm not even going to tie that into an afterlife. In some way, God says that if you keep His commandments, you will be written in this book. I believe it's in Parshat Nitzavim. However,
so we were going to do this, and we were going to talk for a half an hour to 45 minutes.
All right, no,
I'm not upset.
I think it's a healthy back and forth.
I think we had a great discussion. Yeah, I think we had a great discussion. Let's do it again sometime.
Sure. All right.
And probably even on some other topics, even like the Zohar, but we just barely touched on that.
Do you want to plug your website?
Yes. My website is NazareneJudaism.com, or we have a social network at NazareneSpace.com. So, appreciate it.
I appreciate it. And a refuah shlema for your wife. I mean, you have to.
Oh yeah, you're. I didn't know you were aware of that. But yeah, she's been in ill health. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So be well. Thank you.
All right. Shalom.
Okay.